I am Lian from the Philippines. I have been a journalist for 13 years. As a journalist, I have many difficult conversations, but the most difficult has not been with angry government officials or even angry editors. It was with victims who sometimes I've had to explain to why sometimes justice does not feel just. For example, in 2019, after 10 years, there was finally a judgment on the massacre of 58 people by a political dynasty and their private army in the southern island of Mindanao. This was the single deadliest attack on the Philippine press and put us one of the world's most dangerous country for journalists. And it finally had a judgment. It was a good moment until one of the widows called me. I was in front of the Supreme Court. She said, "How soon do you think can I claim my damages because I need it for the hospital bills of my daughter?" The daughter was 10 years old. She's as old as her father's murder case. I'll never forget having to stare at the grand facade of our Supreme Court and having to tell her, "Don't count on the damages just yet, not soon. It will go through appeals." And she said, how much longer do I have to wait? And it was the most difficult "I don't know" that I have ever said in my life. Several years before that, I was at a court in the city capital. A community was petitioning the lower court to get rid of police powers to knock on their doors and search for drugs and drug suspects. The year was 2017, and the death toll of Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs has reached 7,000. The community has been terrorized by knocks, by the possibility of being put in a drug list, or by dead bodies. The court order that day was something that lawyers and reporters would call as very procedural. They had failed to get an injunction. But failed is a strong word for communities. So I watched as their lawyer try her hardest to convert legalese into simple language and assure the anxious people, mostly women, that the merits of the case go on. And the merits of the case go on. In fact, it is still going on because to this day, there is no answer whether it's constitutional for police to knock on doors and randomly search for drugs. The grander ambition, the more ambitious petition to declare the entire campaign against drugs unconstitutional is still pending with our Supreme Court after 6 years. It is important for the communities to ask these questions, but it is also difficult to explain to them why they are not answered until now. For example, one day during lockdown, I was talking with a woman, a mother, who had lost her son, 17 years old at the time, killed by Duterte's policemen. The Philippine Ombudsman has just dropped her case because all the witnesses have withdrawn. And this is a common thing. I have had to navigate cases of witnesses, drug suspects, their families going into hiding out of fear. I have had to drop stories because of safety. So I asked her, "Are you sure you want to speak to me on record?" And she said, "Yes." I asked her, "Aren't you scared?" And she said, "I did not kill my son. They killed my son. Why should I be scared? They should be scared." That took guts. But to be honest, they don't have to be that gutsy. One trauma is enough. That reporters have had to extract these stories out of them repeatedly for the last 6 years is another layer of trauma I, unfortunately and admittedly, have participated in. Since then, the death toll has ballooned to 27,000, and then we just stopped counting. Out of that number, policemen has admitted to killing 7,000 in what they call as legitimate police operations against drugs. They invoke presumption of regularity. Sometime again during the lockdown, there was a drug war story that got on the nerves of important people in high office. These were important sources. They're actually even good people. They were arguing for more belief in the domestic justice process. It is a good argument, but I'm not the one they have to convince. And for a journalist in a company that has been closed down by the Duterte government, it's sometimes tempting to just protect the access to them. But my editors always say, never cede an inch of your freedom to report the truth and always hold the line. But more than the journalistic principle, I wanted to honor the story of victims. Because later that afternoon, I was talking to a widow whose husband was killed in the drug war also, but there's no suspect. And that is emblematic of the 1,000 other cases in the campaign against drugs. There are no suspects. And if there's no suspect, then there's no case, then possibly no justice ever. So she told me, "Lian, I have lost faith in the domestic justice process." Here's a woman who, through grief, had to become a campaigner, an advocate. She organized widows, and they would go to police stations, and they would say, I just need the documents to claim benefits for the dead people from local council because they have to make up those scripts. Otherwise, they don't get the documents ever. And as a journalist, I cannot be that creative. I can only be direct and honest about what I want for information. And many other times, it's difficult to get information. Sometimes a simple question as, how many cases are you investigating? I don't even get a direct answer. So when she says, I have lost trust in the domestic justice process here, I don't have to agree with her, but I understand where it's coming from. But then that leads me to a more difficult conversation, because what's next after the domestic justice process? They say the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court that has no police power. We can all remember when the ICC issued an arrest warrant against Vladimir Putin. It was a good moment, but a good moment for who? For top lawyers, for sure, for advocates, for academics, even for journalists like my colleagues here today who gasps in awe just by being here in The Hague. But how good is it a moment for victims who are not here, who are 1,000 miles away living in poverty and in fear in Manila or in Venezuela or in Uganda or in Burundi? So when they say that they've lost, it always leads me to a difficult conversation, how to manage that expectation from an international criminal court. And when I talk about the ICC, my stories always have to compete with the criticism that ICC is a colonial court. My ICC stories drown in the nagging of Duterte supporters who say, why should they believe the ICC when the United States isn't even a part of the ICC? And that's a good question. But 6 years of coverage and 10 months of taking a law master's degree, I still don't have a good answer to that question. So again, I go back. The good moment for us over a Putin arrest warrant, reveling in the foreign policy implication of it all, can be lost in the everyday struggles of these victims who had lost their providers and their ability to work because of these crimes. Hope is a strong agent, we all know that. But we have to learn to be more careful that they are not utterly false hopes. There are many fake news about the ICC in my country. Most of the fake news come from Duterte himself and from his top legal aides. That's according to Vera Files fact check. Many of the fake news are about jurisdiction, which can easily obfuscate discussion because they're hard to understand. But when Rodrigo Duterte says, I will never subject myself to the judgment of foreigners, it sticks. It sticks because we are a country anxious of invaders, having been colonized for 450 years. And remember, we have a Hague arbitral victory against China in 2016, and yet to this day, it is not truly felt by our fishermen out there in open sea. But this is what I will say about international justice. We never put our dictator, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., on trial at home. Most of the relevant judgments came from abroad. It is an imperfect narrative. So imperfect that it is proving to be helpless against historical revisionism. But it is still one of the last frontiers to preserving the truth about what happened during martial law 36 years ago, one of the darkest era of our country. So for all of its limitations and all of its flaws, we have the chance to make international justice preserve the truth about what went on in those 6 bloody years of Duterte's war on drugs. Victims of the drug war are very proactive. They have the agency. They are transcribing their own experience and documenting their own experience and transcribing their own paperwork to send to the ICC registry. At the very least, we have to make an effort to make them feel that it is not for nothing. Because we can lose cases, we know that. We can lose patients just by trying. That is a fact of the law that we cannot change. But we have a chance to make international justice ensure that Filipinos never forget. Thank you.